Hey everybody. Today I'm reading something from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Matt Gomna. Um, this is from an appendix to a section from that book, and what I'm reading are Burnham's theses. There's a piece called Burnham's Theses. And the footnote to the section says, introduced by James Burnham at the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee on the 5th of September 1939, but later withdrawn. So, here we go. Section 1. The nature of the war as a whole. 1. The Second World War, which has now begun, is as a whole, imperialist and totalitarian in character. It is a work among the great powers for the redivision of the world, and is, from the point of view of both sides and of all participants in the conflict, directed against the interests of the masses. 2. In this war, quote, neutrality is impossible for any nation. The nature of the war makes it certain that within a comparatively short time all nations will be compelled to line up with one side or the other, at the very least, economically, and in the case of most nations and of all the great powers, with military means as well. From the imperialist, totalitarian character of the war as a whole, and the involvement of all nations in the war, it follows that from no point of view or in any respect can it be regarded as being fought for the, quote, defense of the independence of small nations, end quote, the rights of subject nationalities, end quote, or for any other progressive purpose. The conflict as a whole is reactionary, and all secondary or isolated features are subordinated to its reactionary nature. Thesis 4. This war marks the end of bourgeois democracy as a historically possible form of government. Under the conditions of the war, the democratic and fascist imperialisms lose their structural differences and reach identity, in all essential respects, in the totalitarian war dictatorships. Whatever the outcome of the war, it will never be possible for them to return to a bourgeois democratic form of government. This conclusion holds for the United States as for the other nations. The only possible exceptions, which would prove in any case only temporary, would be one or two of the smaller and unimportant nations, and even such exceptions are doubtful. Thesis 5. From the character of the war, it follows that the warring powers are incapable of concluding a just or even a workable peace. Thesis 6. A just and lasting peace can be concluded only by the overthrow of world imperialism as a whole. Thesis 7. The task of the masses, confronted with the war, is to stop the war. This task can be accomplished by the masses only by the overthrow, within each nation, of the war makers, that is, of their own rulers and oppressors. Thesis 8. Within the advanced nations, this task must be carried out through the conquest of power by the working class in the socialist revolution. Thesis 9. The colonial peoples and the subject nationalities can carry out this task by the struggle for freedom and the independence from, quote, their own imperialist oppressors. This struggle must be firmly supported by the international working class. The struggle for the freedom of the colonial peoples and subject nationalities can be carried to success, however, only if the working class maintains in supporting it a socialist policy wholly independent of the native bourgeoisie and bourgeois nationalities, and only if the working class gains leadership in the struggle and succeeds in transforming it into the struggle for workers' revolution. Thesis 10. The perspective of the struggle of the masses against the war is summed up in that of the United Socialist States of Europe, the United Socialist States of the Americas, a free Asia, a free Africa, and the World Federation of Socialist Republics. Section 2. The nature of the Russian state in the light of the war. The numbers restart for the theses. So, Thesis 1. The signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact brought to a definite climax the series of developments within the Soviet Union which began with the rise of Stalin and entered a stage of rapid transformation during the past 5 years. Thesis 2. Internally, the Soviet bureaucracy has carried through a political counter-revolution, which required for its achievement an undeclared but no less actual civil war. Thesis 3. Within the Soviet Union, the present Soviet state has during the past period gone over to an imperialist or quasi-imperialist policy in both political and economic relations toward the minority nationalities within the Soviet borders. 4. During the past period, the Soviet Union has, partly through the destruction of the nationalized forms of economy and partly through the manipulation of them, assumed a definitely exploitative character in the economic realm. A definitely exploitative character in the economic realm. The ruling stratum of the population systematically exploits the masses of the people for its benefit. 5. It is impossible to regard the Soviet Union as a, quote, worker state in any sense whatever. 6. Thesis 6. The ruling stratum of the Soviet Union does not constitute a crystallized bourgeois class in the traditional sense, nor can it be predicted with assurance whether its evolution in the future, even if unchecked, will be toward such crystallization. Thesis 7. The de facto political and economic character of the present Soviet state, and the mode under which its oppression and exploitation is carried on, suggests the term, quote, bureaucratic state, end quote, quote, bureaucratic state. As its most adequate definition, political and economic power and privilege, as well as the state apparatus, are the property of the bureaucracy and its affiliates. The property of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's affiliates. Thesis 8. This analysis is confirmed by an examination of the external policy of the present Soviet state, the armed and material intervention of the Soviet state externally, from having been revolutionary in its first period and that what might be called passive or non-revolutionary in its middle period, has now become counter-revolutionary during the latest period. Thesis 9. The present Soviet state, as the present Soviet state functions both internally and externally, is no longer a bulwark, even partially or indirectly, of what remains of the socialized economy, but is exclusively a bulwark of the power and privilege of the bureaucracy, the interests of which are now in complete conflict with all progressive remains in the socialized economy. Thesis 10. In foreign relations generally, during the years since 1933, the policy of the present Soviet state, in serving the aims of the bureaucracy, has become wholly subordinated to one or other of the groups of imperialist powers, a development culminating in the pact with Hitler. Section 3. The question of the defense of the Soviet Union. Thesis 1. The policy of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, was predicated upon the proletarian character of the Soviet state and the conception of 4 possible types of war in which that state might be involved. 1. A war of defense against imperialist intervention. 2. A civil war. 3. An external war of liberation, in which the Soviet forces aided the toilers and oppressed of some nation or nations against their rulers and oppressed. 4. A so-called, quote, mixed war, in which the Soviet state would be compelled to join military forces with one or another group of contending imperialist powers. All these types of war occurred, and the policy was upheld for all of them. Thesis 2. Conditions are now altogether changed. First, an external war of liberation is now excluded. The external military intervention of the present Soviet state could now be, not revolutionary in character, in support of the toilers against their oppressors, but counter-revolutionary, in support of one or another set of rulers against the masses. In such cases, therefore, defense of the Soviet Union is social patriotism and must be abandoned for a defeatist policy. 3. In the case of internal war, revolutionists are now committed to support, not of the present Soviet state, but of the revolutionary struggle of the Russian workers and peasants against that state, and a struggle for freedom of subjection nationalities from the state, e.g., as in the case of the struggle for a free Soviet Ukraine. Far from defending the Soviet state in such cases, we call upon the workers and peasants of Russia to overthrow and to re-establish their own socialist power. And we call on the subject peoples, joining with their brothers now under the rule of other nations, to fight for their freedom against both the rulers of those nations and the rulers of the Soviet state. Thesis 4. The case of a, quote, mixed war is no longer abstract but concrete. It is the present war. The armed intervention of the Soviet Union in the present war is almost certain, and its political and economic intervention has already taken place. This infrastructure will be wholly subordinated to the general imperialist character of the conflict as a whole, and will be in no sense a, quote, defense of the remains of the socialist economy, but on the contrary, the sure means toward the elimination of what progressive remains there still are. Under these circumstances, defense of the Soviet Union would be social patriotism, and a major barrier also to revolutionary developments among the peoples of the other warring powers. Revolutionists must call upon the Russian workers and peasants to join hands with the workers and peasants of all the powers, of Poland and Germany and France and England and the United States, to stop the war and conclude a just peace by the overthrow of their own rulers and oppressors. Thesis 5. The one remaining case is that of combined imperialist intervention against an isolated Russia. To answer in advance what should be the policy of the revolutionists in this instance is impossible, since the problem is abstract. The real war is not occurring in this manner, and an indefinite variety of changes might well occur before any such event took place, granted that there is any likelihood of it. If such an event had taken place yesterday, or took place today, the present Soviet state would occupy a role comparable to that of the local rulers of a semi-colonial or, quote, comprador nation. And since the success of the imperialist interventionists would strengthen world imperialism and their defeat weaken it, material support of the Soviet state would be the mandatory policy. Bracket. Section 4 resumes more or less the common stock ideas of the Trotskyists on anti-war agitation in the United States. Thanks for listening.